everyone. I'm Katie Tigler, and I'm here today with Tony Peppers, CEO of Egress Software, to talk about human layer security. Tony, thanks for joining me.
Really nice to meet you again, Katie. How's things? You okay?
We're all doing well. How's everything across the pond there?
Yeah, really good. It's this strange now normal that we find ourselves in, but we're all navigating through it one day at a time, 1 week at a time, right?
One day at a time, 1 week at a time, that's for sure. And it's been an interesting transition for everybody, but certainly in cybersecurity. And what you do as a company fits right in with this whole pandemic. It's not, goodness, we don't want anybody listening and watching to think that there's any kind of abuse of the system, because that's not what you do at all. But what you do complements the pressures, the fears, the uncertainty of everything going on in our world. And I've had the opportunity, and Tag Cyber has had the opportunity to work with you and your team over at Egress. We've done some papers together. We did this really fun survey project focused on human layer security. And that addresses some of the things that happen in our world as we're interacting with our digital assets, and especially when those fears, those pressures, the tiredness get ratcheted up. But
Right.
typically, egress would be, in a traditional sense, it would be categorized as email security or endpoint security. But
Right.
that's not what you say you do. You talk about human layer security. So, Tony, what is it? Why is it important?
Well, it's a great question, right? And I think it's because the world has been evolving for quite some time in this space, and you're dead right. COVID-19 has merely accelerated the need to protect the business that has often been, I wouldn't say ignored for a long time, but it's maybe other areas have taken precedence for whatever reason. And I think maybe traditionally the enterprise has kind of looked at the organization and protected the network layer, and then of course the application layer. But increasingly in today's world, the only way to mitigate against today's threats, modern day threats, is actually to protect the human layer within your business. Because statistically now, while lots of airtime is given to external threats, outsider threats, I think in reality businesses are more at risk of existing employees inside their business today being the biggest risk in their company. And actually, again, when we look at that, again, you might instinctively think of it as malicious insiders. But again, a lot of the research that we've done, and we've done tons with Tag Cyber, and that we've also uncovered similar results, is that actually it's often well-intended employees that love the company they work for, that work crazy hours, because they really believe in the mission. They're just making mistakes, and actually it's those type of human errors that we need to really address in this day and age. And the only way to do that is to wrap technology and tools around people to help them do their job, and offer a safety net for the common mistakes that we all do. So that's where I think human layer security is really just an evolution of how we've tried to tackle this for many years.
So human layer is sort of the antithesis. So you said evolution, I agree with that, but it's also sort of the antithesis of the quote, human is the weakest link, end quote, which is a really negative connotation. And personally, I've always thought people shaming wasn't a great idea, but we've done it for so long in security. We're all a little guilty of it. But from your perspective, as the head of a company building and offering software to help with human-initiated issues, how is the language, how is the shift in perspective beneficial? In other words, how does the approach, quote, we're helping humans when they're busy, tired, overwhelmed, etc., how does that improve cybersecurity?
Well, I think you're dead right. And I think for too long, there's been a blame culture on where did the incident come from? And again, when we look at all of our research, because up until relatively recently, there hasn't been a technology platform and available for customers to really understand where the problems are coming from. So in effect, we've relied heavily on people to self-report, Katie. We've relied on people to put their hand up and say, I think I've made a mistake, and then report that to maybe information governance or information security. I think the reality is, but you're dead right, there's a blame culture within business that say, oh, the problems have come from people. We don't like any of the language around people are your biggest weakness, people are your weakest link, because that just, all that does is fuel that, well, I shouldn't, there's not a culture of transparency within an organization. The reality is, it is a company's responsibility to put tools out there and available for employees to help them be more productive and reduce risk. And actually, in reality, in this day and age today, we've got legacy tools that don't really achieve the goal, and we've got regulatory compliance that's more draconian than ever. So therefore, the stakes are higher than ever. And I don't think it really encourages this openness around it. It is a genuine mistake. People are busy, they're stressed, they're tired. COVID has only accelerated that. It is not the employee's absolute responsibility to take control of this. It is their responsibility to be careful, but ultimately we all make mistakes. So I think we have to move the language, we have to move the narrative to helping people do the right thing and be a safety net for those where we all make mistakes. Because to your point before, Katie, we're all only human, and we all will continue to make mistakes. So I think we need to help people to ultimately avoid those mistakes that are not intentional. And I think when you look at the vast majority of incidents, it is unintentional breaches of security, as opposed to malicious insiders that are doing something knowingly and recklessly to harm the business. So I think we need to sub-select on the much wider group within the business.
And I think that's a really good point, because when you say human layer security, it says that this is an important piece of it, but it's not the entirety of it. So it acknowledges that there are different parts, different pieces, different ways we have to look at security, and you can't come at it from an all or nothing point of view.
You're absolutely right. So cybersecurity awareness is another key part of this story, right? But I think we all know that when you are embedding best practice security, often, even with cybersecurity and awareness training, people need a safety net wrapped around them day in and day out, morning, noon, and deep into the evening. When you're on that subway and you've just got to get that message sent out, or maybe probably more realistic in this day and age, you're just about to pick the kids up from school and you have to get an email out, and you just don't check for whether you've added the right recipient, or maybe more commonly you're sending to the right people but you've attached the wrong document. These are just such commonplace mistakes, and all it takes is technology to surface up, play back to the user and say, are you sure you mean to send this? And just give that extra second to avoid a breach before it happens. But you're absolutely right, it is part of a macro strategy wrapped around people with the right intentions to ultimately build better security.
So that's a good pivot point here. So you're talking about all of the things that impact us in our lives. When we're busy, when we're tired, we're trying to answer emails at a stoplight. We know we shouldn't, but answer those emails at a stoplight, or answer them when we're doing our grocery shopping, or answering them in between other activities. We're trying to be productive. We're trying to be good corporate citizens. But in some ways that increases the risk. So Tony, you've been with us, you've spoken with us, and people can obviously visit your website and read about you, but for those who aren't familiar with Egress and what your technology does, explain what it is and how it's different than email security in any of its forms, or different than anti-phishing. So just a nice little review for everyone, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'd love to actually. So I think the biggest difference with our platform is that we are focusing on detecting human abnormality. So any behaviors that you simply wouldn't normally do in your day-to-day work. And that could be as simple as I'm regularly communicating with Katie all the time, sending lots of emails, and I often add Miles, or I might add Ed into that dialogue, into that email chain. But I may be communicating with lots of Eds at any one time. And our technology is designed to the moment that you include an individual into an email chain that you wouldn't normally include, then at that point in time, it will play back to the person sending the message or about to send the message, and give them really simple traffic light warnings. So it might be going from, it should be always green. 9 times out of 10, we're not making mistakes, but that moment where something doesn't look normal, then first of all, you'd get a simple traffic light, so you'd know it doesn't look the same. But at the point of send, if you haven't noticed that, it would pop up and say, you don't normally include this individual, or you wouldn't normally attach this file and this content when talking to this particular person. So it's designed to be a safety net, never pop up and irritate and annoy people, but only pop up when something's outside of the norm. So across our entire customer base, our research says that an end user would typically see a prompt asking the person to check what they're about to do somewhere between 4 and 8 times a month. So that would be maybe once or twice a week. So I think what's interesting is people don't make mistakes every day. But when you aggregate that up against an organization with 5,000 or 10,000 employees, that's really quite meaningful. And I know many, many tens of thousands of errors that happen and go undetected. So I think our technology is designed to sit in the background and do nothing until such time where you're about to send an email with really sensitive data to a client, and it's the wrong recipient or it's the wrong data. And at that point, and only that point, will it interact with the employee and then give them an opportunity to make a change before that breach has happened.
That's really cool, because I don't know about you, or I don't know about anybody watching this. You sent an email, again, I've done it, sent an email, and as it's sending, fortunately now a lot of the platforms we use have tools built in where it will give you a 5 or 10-second delay. And as it's sending, you go off and you try to do something else. In a few cases, I've looked back at that email and I've gone, oh, no, like, stop, and you're frantically hitting send. Yours is sort of a stop sending on steroids.
Right.
And it helps. And even if it's past that 5 or 10 seconds, there's an alert where somebody can go back and say, oh, yeah, that was Katie with a Y instead of Katie with an IE. And it prevents that oops moment.
We've all been there, right? And there's nothing more spine tingling. Well, actually, there's 2 cases, actually, Katie, which is more interesting. The one is the one everyone has felt, which is that spine tingling moment where you know you have made a mistake and you rush into your sent items. You're maybe even pulling the network cable out of your machine, or you're trying to disable the wireless. Something's got to stop that email leaving, right? And then it arrives in the sent folder and it's gone. And there's not a lot you can do about it. And then there's a moment there where that individual has got a big decision to make. Do I tell people? Who do I tell? So you'll start to reflect on the content and think, is it sensitive? Isn't it insensitive? If it's got an attachment, what was in it? You know an email is likely to come back your way with the classic subject line of, was this meant for me? And that's where it suddenly, that's where it takes the decision out of your hands of, should I tell somebody, to now I'm probably gonna have to tell somebody, because now our clients are aware of it. But that moment is unavoidable. And it requires technology that's clever enough to do that. So 5 years ago, Katie, you just wouldn't be able to do this. And I think the reason why it's so interesting now is with the advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence, which allows companies like ours to leverage that and be able to programmatically look at all the relationships you've ever sent to, the content you've ever sent to, and then in real time, literally in a matter of nanoseconds, be able to interact with you and say, you've never done this before, just check. 5 years ago, that technology simply wasn't available. The underlying platform wasn't available to be able to do that. And that's why it makes it so interesting. But I think there's another use case too, which is if you don't know you've made a mistake and you've sent an email to the wrong person, maybe you've added the wrong attachment, you don't know to report it. And if that individual never replies back and says, was this meant for me? You don't know to report that either. So I think that is why there's an order of magnitude number of cases out there that go unreported. Some knowingly unreported, and others that simply the person didn't know they made a mistake and it was never brought back. So I think when we go into customers and show them this technology and implement it, the number of incidents that have been reported versus the number of incidents that we are proactively stopping and preventing is in some cases 5 times more, but in many instances it's actually more like 10 times the number of incidents. So I was only speaking to a customer last week where one particular department within the business said in one single day we had 17 reported incidents of a breach due to a misdirected email. Now, since they've rolled out the software, that department has gone from 0 in the last 3 months. So I think this can be almost eliminated actually by technology that is so accurate that it can ultimately interact with the user, learn with the user as their habits change. And the best bit about all of this, Katie, is it doesn't need any administrators to manage. Machine learning models update on their own, so you don't need to create rules and manage those rules. You simply deploy a plug into Outlook and it just looks after itself.
Yeah, it's really important because it's one of those things you don't really think of until, the old phrase, the horse is out of the barn. But then when you start looking at it, you go, oh my goodness, this problem is more prevalent than I think. So that's important. But that also leads me to my next question, which is about research, because Egress does a lot of your own research, and you fairly recently released your 2020 Outbound Email Data Breach Report. So tell everybody watching, what are some of the more interested or unexpected findings from that report?
Well, so it was a fascinating report, and we did a report the year prior to that on inside the threat, but this particular report, we felt it was really important that we dug a lot deeper specifically into email, because what was, again, very obvious to us, but it makes sense, is that the task performed for human error every single time sending an email was in the top 2 incidents. So that's the task behind what caused an unintentional breach. So logically, we needed to dig into this in more detail. And what I suppose there's 4 elements of that report I can sort of bring out. The first is, so we surveyed 500 organizations, 250 in the United States and 250 in EMEA to get a nice blend. But 94% of those organizations said that it's certainly in the last 12 months, email traffic had exponentially risen. I think that's in part with all the changes in COVID-19 and with remote working and the fact that so many more employees are now working from home and communicating digitally rather than maybe using old mechanisms that they might have relied on in the past. So physical post, would you believe, is still in the United States and in Europe is still seen as a mechanism to communicate, whereas that's just simply not possible now. So almost every company said that email traffic was up 94% of those organizations. What was interesting for us was back to this, how big is the problem? 1 in 2 of those organizations we surveyed, and we've got the detail for every one of those outlined, said that actually it increased 50% or more. So we're talking a big hike. But it was something you touched on before. 37% of the breaches caused in the research was caused either by stress or by tiredness. So these are well-intended employees that are just either stressed with workloads or stressed with different unfamiliar environments and are tired, either morning, noon, or evening, and it's those causes which is causing for mistakes to be able to happen. And I suppose the final stat was 35% of the most serious breaches were caused by remote working. So when you looked at all of that pulled together, the impact of COVID-19 driving out the remote workforce numbers just to numbers that we've never seen in history before, and coupled with the exponential traffic that's driven by email, it's really no surprise that human error and incidents via email are increasing in line with both those trends, really. So I think for us, all it made us realize is that You have to tackle this in a completely new way where you wrap tools around our people, give them a safety net, allow them to operate at pace, allow them to operate productively, but eliminate that classic case of human error, because with technology, it really can be that effective.
And I think that's a really good point, because right now, most of the world is still, where possible, allowing employees to work from home. But it's long been my belief that we're moving, yeah, we've seen it over the past decade. We've seen companies moving to more remote. Some startups operate increasingly remote or entirely remote. And I think when, cross fingers, all of this is over with COVID, I don't think we're going to go back to the kind of work-based environments we ever did. I think we're going to see at least a 20 to 30% jump in remote work for companies. And I also think that technology and consumerism have put an extra burden on us as humans, the expectation that you're not going to sit on an email for 24 hours, the expectation that you're going to be available at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the evening after you put the kids to bed, even if you've already worked an 8 or 10-hour day, even if you are doing the dishes. And that in itself, it's this confluence of technology and expectations and environment that create the need for this human layer of security, but human layer supported by technology.
I couldn't agree more, and I think you're right. I share the same view, Katie. I think Pandora's box is open, and it's going to be difficult to try and wrap that back up, and in 6 months from now say, well, let's all go back to where we used to be and be in the office 5 days a week. I think that's not going to happen. No one knows the extent of which it's going to happen. I do agree with you. I think flexible working now will be available for everybody to some extent. I think what's also really interesting is that heightened awareness now by every company that this is a problem, and customers and customers' supply chain need to outwardly demonstrate that they've got a handle on this problem. So what we're hearing, interestingly enough, is an enormous amount of pressure from customers' supply chain, calling in, emailing in, and saying, what are you doing to tackle the problem, to make sure that our data is only shared with us? Because they recognize that compliance regulation is higher than ever, and actually they need to understand that their supply chain is taking it seriously and have technical controls in place to solve it. What gets even worse is I've seen for years customers solutionizing the problem and trying to think that DLP in its legacy form will in some way tackle this, because you know what, I guess if I look at all the technology bubbles and groups and categories, is that the closest that might tackle this? Is DLP the closest that might mean if I say to my supply chain, put these DLP rules in place to stop my data being sent to everyone else? Maybe that's the answer, and it's simply not the answer, because DLP has no context on the information you're sharing and who you're sharing it with and where there's mistakes. So all it's really doing is wrapping customers up in knots, making it completely unworkable for them to be able to share content with a whole variety of suppliers. So I think the reality is it isn't just a differentiator to help your employees to be able to operate at pace with no risk and give them the tools that, quite frankly, they need. But it also is critically important to outwardly demonstrate that to your supply chain, especially in a world which is highly differentiated now, Katie, where it's like, well, if I'm not going to work with this law firm that has those controls in place, I know the law firm down the road does, or this investment bank versus the other, or this private healthcare versus the other. I think it's critical now that we outwardly demonstrate that it is the corporate responsibility to tackle this, because tools are available. So I think in a very short period of time, maybe in the next 12 to 18 months, I think human layer security will be table stakes for doing business in the same way as network security and application security is. I think this, and yet we'll get there much faster because of the remote working conditions we find ourselves in.
Getting that little extra push that companies need, because really, if legacy DLP worked, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation.
No, we would not, and I think like all technology, right? It's not its fault that it doesn't work. It just evolves, right?
Right.
The
Yes.
the beauty of technology in the world we're in, every 5 or 10 years, there is a disruption in how we tackle something. And it just so happens right now, there is a real disruption of how we tackle human error in business, and human layer security. An intelligent way of tackling it is the only way to solve it long term.
Great way of putting it. Well, Tony, thank you for spending so much time with us. For everybody watching and listening, go visit our friends Egress's website, check out what they have to do. We appreciate you watching this video, and we hope you come back for the next one. Tony, have a great, I guess, your evening or afternoon over there, and we'll talk to you soon.
You too, Katie. A pleasure as always.